We begin today as Russia's Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov held meetings with U.S. State Secretary Rex Tillerson and President Trump in Washington today. The talks were the first meeting between Foreign Minister Lavrov and President Trump and were not originally on the schedule. They spoke about the fight against terrorism, situation in Syria, North Korea, and Ukraine, and stated that the meetings were positive. Donald Trump had this to say on the talks with Lavrov.
And I think that we're going to do very well with respect to Syria. I think things are happening that are really positive. We're going to stop the killing and the death. We had a very good meeting with Mr. Lavrov.
RT's Alexey Yaroshevsky was at the Russian foreign minister's press conference and filed this report.
Just as the U.S. president, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov seemed very optimistic and positive about the talks he held today in Washington, D.C. The meeting with the president, with Donald Trump, in fact, was a surprise meeting. It was announced late last night. Initially, Mr. Lavrov was supposed to meet only his U.S. counterpart, Rex Tillerson. Nonetheless, we understand that the meeting itself, in essence, was a continuation of the talks on the pressing world affairs that the two sides have had in the last month, when Rex Tillerson came to Moscow on the 12th and 13th of April, and also the conversation on the phone that Trump and Putin had on May the 2nd. The topics, we understand, were the very same today. It's the two countries' fight against world terrorism, the situation in Syria, de-escalation of the Korean problem at this moment, and also finding ways to peacefully resolve the Ukrainian crisis. I managed to ask the Foreign Minister Lavrov about the de-escalation zones in Syria, something that he believes would be the solution for the entire Syrian conflict, and something that he says the Trump administration agrees with. So I asked him about the pessimism recently expressed by the Pentagon relating to the de-escalation zones, which said that there was still a lot of devil in the details.
The devil's always in the detail. It's a well-known fact. In Astana, we agreed further steps that will be taken so that the interested parties will agree on how and who will secure the de-escalation zones. We've confirmed today our interest in the US role, and I think they're also interested in that.
The bulk of the press conference and the answers by the Russian foreign minister were dedicated to the bilateral ties between Washington and Moscow, which these days, Lavrov admitted, were not at a good state, has still a lot to be desired. But nonetheless, he reaffirmed Trump's commitment to making these ties better, pragmatic, and mutually beneficial. But at the same time, the Russian foreign minister fired a few shots at Trump's predecessor.
Our bilateral relations aren't very positive, and the reason for that is well known. The previous administration did everything to undermine the basis of it. Trump has shown that he wants to establish constructive and productive relations with Russia.
Quite obviously, Lavrov's arrival to the nation's capital was preceded by a lot of furor in the media and among the politicians, as everything related to Russia these days. And believe it or not, as many as 4 questions about the alleged Russian meddling in the U.S. election were asked at the press conference. At times, it even seemed that the reporters were not listening to what Lavrov had to say initially. And by the time the 4th question about the Russian meddling, the alleged Russian meddling, came by, Lavrov seemed somewhat irritated.
Did I understand correctly that President Trump hasn't brought up Russian involvement in the U.S. election last year?
I've just said that President Trump publicly called it fiction. Put on the table just one single fact, then we'll react to it. It's been going on for months, but there hasn't been a single fact, any evidence presented.
While answering the first question about the alleged Russian meddling, whether this issue had been discussed at all with Trump and Tillerson, Lavrov even used a very old word called bacchanal, which would be more, adequately translated as mayhem. Nonetheless, Mr. Lavrov is now off to Alaska, and we'll keep you posted on how that goes.